This is a clip from Basketball at the Bar Live. Let's talk about the Houston Rockets. The absolute worst team in the Western Conference. 20 wins, 62 losses last year. And that's okay. They have the third pick in this year's NBA draft. Just to real quick give some context as far as the starters go. Currently, Kevin Porter Jr., Jalen Green, Eric Gordon, Deshaun Tate, and Christian Wood are projected as the Houston Rockets starters. As far as the salary cap goes, John Wall has a $47 million player option, which I think he has to opt in here in the next 2 weeks or so. So that'll be pretty interesting. Eric Gordon's locked up for the next 2 years. Christian Wood has one more year left on his deal. Dennis Schroeder, Bruno Fernando are both expiring contracts. And then they got a ton of guys on rookie deals. So, Calvin, I want to hear from you. Where do the Rockets go this offseason?
Man, well, all the teams we're going to talk about today, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the exception maybe of the Sacramento Kings, who at least thanks to the trade deadline last year are maybe further down a path than any of these other teams. The other three teams we're going to talk about, they need so much help. They need so many different things. It's impossible to fix it all in one offseason definitely for Houston and for Oklahoma City, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. But let's start with the draft first. This, to me, is the easiest call for what Houston needs to do in the offseason, and that's because they need front court help first. This is a very guard-heavy team right now, particularly at point guard, which I'll address in a second. But they need some front court help. This draft is, we've already talked about it, a three-player draft. That's what everybody's saying. And the top three players are all front court players.
Perfect.
Now, they're probably going to miss out on the first two guys, Holmgren and Smith, which means it should be a no-brainer for them to take Banchero at 3. Mm-hmm. Very, very skilled offensive player, can fit into what they want to do offensively, get up and down, stretch the floor. I think he can play alongside Christian Wood. I would also look to add another center in free agency. This team was dead last in rebounding. So guys that are out there right now, again, these guys aren't going to be like franchise-changing players day one, but they could really help address a big area of need for this team. Guys like Yusuf Nurkic, who averaged over, I think, 11 rebounds a game last year, over 8.5 for his career. Kevon Looney is a guy that's going to be a free agent. We've already seen in the postseason how great he is, particularly on the offensive glass. And he's another guy that would allow them to keep playing this small ball lineup like we see the Warriors do with him as well. So there's a couple guys out there. Bobby Portis is another one that I would look at. I don't know how he would fit necessarily with Christian Wood, but he had a great year last year, so I think it's worth maybe looking into. And DeAndre Ayton, again, should be on everybody's radar, especially with the reports coming out recently that he seems to have played his last game in Phoenix, is what it looks like. So draft Banchero, look for some center help, particularly to get rebounding help as well. And then the biggest problem for them, or the biggest question, is what do they do at point guard? Kevin Porter Jr. put up a lot of really good numbers for them last year, but were they empty stats? Does he fit next to Jalen Green? I'm not convinced that he does. He turns the ball over a ton on the team that turned it over more than any other team in the NBA last year. I think for the past 2 seasons, he's averaged over 3 turnovers a game. This is also a guy that shoots 41% from the field. Very inefficient player right now. Doesn't mean he can't get better, but I'm worried about that long-term fit. And then John Wall is kind of holding them hostage at this point right now. There really isn't much of a trade market for him, A, because of the contract, B, because of the injury problems. Mm-hmm. Russell Westbrook was probably the most talked about trade. I don't see that happening anymore. So if I'm John Wall, I'm not going to miss out on $47 million if they don't want to restructure my deal. I'm going to opt into that, which definitely puts the Rockets in an unfavorable situation, because now they have this question mark at point guard with a guy that makes an incredible amount of money and is, as you mentioned before we went on air here, only played 70-something games in the last 4 years.
Yeah.
Or you go with Kevin Porter Jr., who's a turnover machine.
Yeah, I think John Wall made it pretty clear that he doesn't want to play for Houston, even if he does opt in for this deal. I'm actually looking at the John Wall contract as a positive for the Rockets. I look at this roster. There's nobody you really have to pay this season or going into next season. There's nobody you really have to pay. And I don't think you're going to be competing for a title next year at all. So John Wall is not a bad thing. He's basically a $50 million expiring contract for them after next season, which I think is great because that could, position them to where they need to repay Christian Wood if they decide to keep him. They need to pay Kevin Porter Jr. if they decide to keep him. And Jayshawn Tate as well is also going to be a free agent in 2022, 2024. I think they have some good building blocks as far as Christian Wood. I like Jalen Green, and I actually do like Kevin Porter Jr. The mental thing is a whole different situation and what happened with him in Cleveland and all that stuff, but I think the dude's an absolute baller on the court. And I love to just see these young guys just kind of develop together and see what I actually can get out of them. I think you hit it right on the head there with the draft. Having the third pick is key for them because no matter what, they're going to get a good piece here, whether it's Bonchero, whether it's Smith, whether it's Holmgren, like they're going to get a great guy. And all these are positions and needs for them. So I think that's a win-win for them. You mentioned the center position, which, if they draft one of these guys, maybe they'll be solidified between whoever that is and Christian Wood. Maybe they go in a different direction. This, for me, is actually a sleeper team for Rudy Gobert. I could potentially see a situation where John Wall is shipped out for Rudy Gobert. I think that could help the Jazz. Maybe they work out a buyout with John Wall. Maybe they facilitate a three-team trade. We've heard the Clippers have been interested in John Wall. So maybe they work out a three-team deal. But I could definitely see Rudy Gobert playing on this team next year. And if you were to tell me that they have Kevin Porter Jr., Jalen Green, Christian Wood, Rudy Gobert, and whoever they draft this next year, I think that's a pretty good starting point. Maybe they are not quite a playoff team. Maybe they're fighting for a play-in spot. I'm not quite sure. But I think that's a great start. This team has a lot of young guys on it. They need to get rid of Eric Gordon. I think it's time. He's making $19.5 million next year, and then a $20 million partially guaranteed deal the year after that. Other than Wall and Gordon, everybody else is on a great contract on this team. And I think the team is set up very well for future cap flexibility.
I'm curious, if you're Houston, how are you going to acquire Gobert? Who are you going to offer in that deal?
John Wall.
You think Utah's doing that deal?
I think it could potentially be a three-team deal between the Clippers, the Jazz, and the Rockets.
The Clippers?
Yeah, they've been interested in John
Wall
Wall.
is going to the Clippers.
They've been interested in Wall this offseason. And, even if it's just a straight Wall for Gobert trade, if Utah is blowing it up, Wall's an expiring contract after next season. So they basically got rid of Gobert's deal and let him off the books and have future cap flexibility, as opposed to paying that guy $50 million for, I think, the next 3 years he's under contract. Mm-hmm. Maybe they can squeeze a draft pick out of Houston. If I'm Houston, I'm not giving up the third pick and Wall for Gobert. But I think Houston is a sleeper for Gobert.
Yeah, I could see that. I wouldn't want. I don't know. I don't know how much the deal really helps either team. I get what you're saying about Utah getting some money off their books for 2 years from now because they'll lose Gobert and Wall's contract would be expiring. But it really
a year from now because they're not making the playoffs.
Well, yeah, okay,
or the finals.
Utah is tough to read though, right? Because they're suddenly in this moment of, do we blow it up and go full rebuild, or are we still trying to compete? I don't know how much doing that deal helps them compete right now, so it would be interesting to see. And Alfred Sagan is another nice young piece that this team has. Didn't play a ton of games last year. I think they like what they have with him. But again, he's not a bad rebounder, but not an athletic center by any means. A little bit smaller for what the traditional NBA center in today's league looks like. So I still think they need to add some guys that are going to help rebounding.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we both agree that this team is not competing next year. So they have maybe 2-3 year window to kind of figure out this rebuild.
I don't think it would be a bad thing for them to bring in some veterans that get slotted in the starting lineup and mean that some of these younger guys are still coming off the bench. Jayshawn Tate would be one of those guys who at one point last year was averaging like 22 a game off the bench for this team. Alfred Sagan would be another one.
Maybe a wing.
Even Boncaro. I don't think there is a likely scenario maybe that he wouldn't end up starting, but I don't necessarily think it's the worst case scenario if they do have that guy coming off the bench for them, at least to begin the year.
I read an article this morning saying Boncaro was the next Kevin Durant. That could be pretty high-powered offense on this team, having Kevin Porter Jr., Jalen Green, Christian Wood, and Boncaro all on the same squad.
Yeah.
That could be a lot of fun to watch. Any last comments on the Rockets before we move on? My hopes are high for this team. I think that they're doing it the right way. I think they have a bright future. It just might take a couple years.
Yeah, they've got a lot of really, really good young individual talented players on this team. The question is how does it extrapolate out in a few years from the team fit standpoint? Jalen Green had a phenomenal rookie season, but people seem to either be really high on him or really low on him in terms of his ultimate ceiling and ultimate potential in the league. A lot of people think maybe he's just a scorer and nothing else, or is going to put up really big numbers on a bad team, stuff like that. That's not my opinion necessarily. I think he's incredibly talented, but it does make a huge difference how you build the team around him.
Yeah, I expect Jalen Green to take the Anthony Edwards leap next season.
Oh, wow.
And average over 20 points a game and be a very efficient player, but still young, still learning, still making mistakes, all that stuff. Progressive G's talking about Sagan again. Will be a stud in a few years if gets consistent minutes. I could see that. I could definitely see that.
Yeah, Bamba was another guy that I was considering mentioning here as well as a potential pair.
It's just tough because I like Christian Wood a lot. And if you get Banchero and Christian Wood, you're pretty much set in those two guys as far as like starters, if you want them both to be your starters. And a team that's this young can afford to throw rookies in as starters, right? Because they're not really going anywhere next season.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the rotations, the starting lineup would be really, you'd have decisions to be made there because in a perfect world, I think you'd slide Banchero to the 3 and play him Wood and, whether it's Sagan or let's say you end up with Rudy Gobert or another center or something like that. The problem with that is Banchero's biggest knock right now is defense. And perimeter defense, I think, would be an even bigger area of concern. If you're going to play him at the 3, that means he's going to be out on the wing guarding a bunch of smaller compared to him in some instances, guys, and that isn't necessarily the right fit for him, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Bright future ahead for the Rockets, that's for sure. If you're a Rockets fan, make sure you hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the channel. We're going to be talking about the Houston Rockets and many other teams this offseason. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or any thoughts on what they're going to do this offseason, let us know down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. As always, please don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You can join us live every single weekday, Monday through Friday.